3. The Freak Show, Deconstructing Creepiness, on Clowns, Evil Laughs, and Mental Illness. We sometimes use terms that ascribe negative traits to people we don't really know. That guy is creepy. What a weirdo. She's freaking me out. We say these things as though creepiness or weirdness or freakness is something that a person is, rather than the result of a situation. But if we stop and think for a minute, what actually is creepiness? Do people know when they are creepy? Are you creepy? Until recently, there was no actual science to help us understand creepiness. It was only in 2016 that Francis McAndrew and Sarah Coenke published the first empirical study on the topic. They wanted to put their fingers on this seemingly elusive concept. As they wrote, given its pervasiveness in everyday human social life, it's very surprising that no one has studied it in a scientific way. So, what is going on when we feel that someone is creepy? McAndrew and Coenke argue that being creeped out is the result of an inbuilt threat detector. A detector that lets us know something is off by giving us feelings of confusion and unpleasantness, or feeling the chills. But describing what creepiness feels like isn't good enough. The researchers asked, if it is a threat detector, what is it warning us about? They argued that creepiness cannot just be a clear warning of physical or social harm. A mugger who points a gun in your face and demands money is certainly threatening and terrifying, yet most people would probably not use the word creepy to describe the situation. So, they set out to discover what we interpret as creepy. The first thing their 1,341 participants were asked to do was to consider the following scenario. Think of a close friend whose judgment you trust. Now, imagine that this friend tells you that she or he just met someone for the first time and tells you that this person was creepy. Participants then rated the likelihood that the person had one of the 44 different behavior patterns or physical characteristics. They found that almost all, 95.3% of the participants stated that men were more likely to be creepy than women. They also found a number of creepy features or behaviors that were strongly linked to one another and may be at the core of creepiness. Participants rated the following as the most likely characteristics of a creepy person. The person stood too close to your friend. The person had greasy hair. The person had a peculiar smile. The person had bulging eyes. The person had long fingers. The person had unkempt hair. The person had very pale skin. The person had bags under his or her eyes. The person was dressed oddly. The person licked his or her lips frequently. The person was wearing dirty clothes. The person laughed at unpredictable times. The person made it nearly impossible for your friend to leave the conversation without appearing rude. And finally, the person relentlessly steered the conversation towards one topic. A number of other characteristics were also associated with creepiness, included being extremely thin, not looking your friend in the eye, asking to take a picture of your friend, watching your friend before interacting with them, asking about details of your friend's personal life, being mentally ill, talking about their own personal life, displaying inappropriate emotion, being older, and steering the conversation towards sex. That's a lot of differencing that can make someone, particularly men, appear creepy. What do creepy people do for a living? Apparently, the creepiest professions are in this order: clown, taxidermist, sex shop owner, and funeral director. The least creepy profession, I think, meteorologist. On top of these main factors, it's generally believed that creepy people don't have insight into their own creepiness. In fact, 59.4% of participants thought that creepy people don't know that they are creepy. On top of this, most thought that creepy people cannot change. What does all this mean? The authors asked the participants about the general nature of creepy people, and most of the characteristics tapped into three core factors. They make us fearful or anxious. Creepiness is seen as a part of the personality of the individual rather than just their behavior, and we think that they may have a sexual interest in us. The authors further explain that while they may not be overtly threatening, individuals who display unusual patterns of nonverbal behavior, unemotional responses, or highly distinct physical characteristics are outside of the norm. and by definition unpredictable. This may activate our creepiness detector and increase our vigilance as we try to discern if they are in fact something to be feared from or not the person in question. The characteristics captured in the list suggest that creepy person your friend is interacting with is hard to predict. Creepiness, it turns out, is probably our reaction to not knowing whether or not we should be scared of someone. But first, let's establish how accurate this superficial assessment is. Can we tell from a brief encounter whether someone is trustworthy or whether they are likely to hurt us? How often does this assessment misfire, and what are the consequences when it does? Apparently, we make intuitive assessments about trustworthiness within 39 milliseconds of seeing a photo of someone's face. So, let's start there. One of my favorite tiny studies on whether we can accurately judge a person by their face comes from a 2008 paper published by Stephen Porter and colleagues in Canada. In this study, they asked participants to rate 34 photos of adult male faces. Half of the photos were of trustworthy people, and the other half were of untrustworthy people. The photos in the two groups were matched in terms of the facial hair expressions and ethnicity. Participants were asked to rate each person on trustworthiness, kindness, and aggressiveness, having only a photo of their face to rely on. How did the researchers know that the people in the photos were trustworthy? Well, this is the best part. The trustworthy people had either received the Nobel Peace Prize or the Order of Canada and had been acknowledged as paragons in their devotion for humanity, peace, and society. The other half were from the America's Most Wanted list, profiles of people eluding justice for extremely serious crimes. They were arguably some very trustworthy people and some very untrustworthy people, at least in terms of their contribution to humanity. The authors write in their summary that in the unlikely event that a participant recognized a face, they were to tell the experimenter, but that none of the 34 targets were recognized by any participant. While the researchers were happy about this, it upsets me that the participants didn't identify any of the faces, not one. Clearly, most wanted pictures are out of fashion, and it also seems that most of us don't know or recognize the heads that house the world's greatest minds. It's a shame. Maybe we should organize a Nobel reality TV show, or the way more of us might start to care about the lives of the brightest among us. So, do you think you could tell the difference between a Nobel winner prize and a serious criminal just from their faces? Participants did slightly worse than if they had just flipped a coin. They identified only 49% of the wanted criminals correctly as untrustworthy. They were slightly better when asked about the Nobel Prize winners, rating them as trustworthy 63% of the time. The authors concluded that, based on the ratings given by participants, people were looking for signs of kindness and aggressiveness in the faces of those they were evaluating, and they concluded that intuition lends a small advantage when making assessments of trustworthiness based on facial appearance. But errors are common. This brings to mind the story of Jeremy Meeks. He became known as the hot villain after a mugshot of him went viral online. He was arrested on charges of possessing firearms illegally, carrying a loaded gun in public, and gang activity. But the internet just responded to his piercing blue eyes, his perfect skin, and his features. He got so much attention for his looks that he was given a modeling contract. This just goes to show how, when someone is dreamy, our whole sense of judgment can be hijacked and potentially put us in danger. Trying together our original creepiness study and our Nobel Prize winners, I present you another team of Canadian researchers. Margot Watt and colleagues published a study in 2017, where they again found that creepy people were generally thought to be lanky men with poor hygiene who behaved awkwardly. They also tested 15 photos from the Porter and colleagues Nobel Winner Prize study. They wanted to know a bit more about other things that influence trustworthiness. They found that one other really important feature that explained the trustworthiness ratings was attractiveness. Attractive people were deemed to be trustworthy, be they Nobel Prize winners or offenders. We see this in romantic comedies. When a hot guy stands outside a window with an old-school ghetto blaster, it's so romantic. On the other hand, When an unattractive guy does the same exact thing, he's a psycho. Someone being attractive certainly puts our creepdar off kilter. We make all kinds of bad decisions around beautiful people. This is related to something called the halo effect, which happens when we assume that to look good is to be good. It's a deeply rooted bias where we assume on a societal level that people who are more attractive are generally more trustworthy, ambitious, healthier. We generally think that they are great. This also is a flip side. The devil effect leads us to believe that people who are undesirable in one way are likely undesirable in all ways. This is even worse when someone also breaks the rules with their behavior, for example, committing a crime. Breaking norms can result in the double devil effect, where someone is seen as fundamentally evil because they look bad and act bad. It's a hard label to shake. Indeed, research shows that people who are unattractive are, on the whole, less likely to get good jobs, get reasonable health care, doctors can be biased too, and are treated less kindly by others. In research that I did in 2015 with colleagues at the University of British Columbia, we found that unattractive and untrustworthy-looking people were convicted of crimes by mock jurors with less evidence and are less likely to be exonerated after evidence that proved their innocence. Other researchers have found similar results, showing that having an untrustworthy face makes it more likely that you will be given a harsher criminal sentence like the death penalty. Back to the What study, where creepy people were thought to be lanky men with poor hygiene. The researchers also found that most people, 72%, stated that they made an evaluation as to whether someone was creepy instantly. This is in line with what we know about judging the personality of strangers. More generally, we pick what we think someone's like instantaneously, intuitively, and it can be hard to change our initial impressions. In fact, it's so automatic that it involves most just the emotion part of the brain, the amygdala, and happens before we have time to think about it. The consequences can be far-reaching and unfair, disadvantaging people simply because of the way they look. Differentness. But putting first impressions to one side, sometimes we do have a bit more time. Sometimes we get the chance to actually hang out with someone rather than just looking at a photo. Does how we interact with a person impact our accuracy? In a 2017 review of literature, Jean-François Bonfaux and colleagues set out to investigate the state of the science regarding our ability to detect people who are trustworthy, labeled in the study as cooperators. They compared findings from studies where people got to have long interactions with one another with studies where people were given only photographs of others. People were okay at detecting how cooperative someone would be in a follow-up game if they had interacted with them, but they struggled when they only saw a picture. People could detect cooperativeness with some small accuracy when they interacted or watched video clips of other players, but their results showed that people have a harder time extracting information from photos. This shows that the way someone moves and presents themselves carries clues as to whether they can be trusted, while pictures aren't as good. But even with pictures, we are still a little bit better than chance at figuring out trustworthiness. What are people picking up upon? When asked, 84% of participants in the original McAndrew and Gwenke study from the beginning of this chapter indicated that creepiness resides in the face, and 80% said that it was all about the eyes. This is a common element that's picked up in horror movies. Evil people in movies, those possessed by evil spirits, vampires, or zombies, often have eyes that are all black, all white, or blood red. We rely on the eyes to give us the first information as to whether someone is normal, further supporting the idea that we are freaked out by people who look or act differently from the norm. The authors of the creepiness study also conclude that definitions of creepiness tended to revolve around the theme of differentness. This is also in line with the idea that what looks good is good, but how do we reconcile the finding that both attractive and typical faces are most trustworthy? Aren't attractive faces more than typical? Not necessarily. In 1990, Judith Langlois and Laurie Rogman were the first of many to demonstrate that attractive faces are only average. They took photos, digested them, and made composite faces that averaged the features of all the photos included in the database. They were creating an impossible image of the prototypical person from that group. They found that the closer they got to an average face by entering more faces into the database, the more attractive the resulting face became. It's unclear exactly why this is, but perhaps it has to do with the brain's natural tendency for abstraction. The brain likes creating prototypes, and perhaps because most of the people we interact with behave in a way that makes them, luckily, trustworthy, we start to see the average characteristics that make their faces as familiar and safe. Having a normal face may also be associated with good health, which is also something that is generally considered safe and attractive. That being said, some people are so stunning that they far exceed the average face. This is where, according to a study by Carmel Sofer and colleagues, the relationship between attractiveness and trustworthiness gets a bit more complicated. As people get more attractive and approach the average face, trustworthiness increases. But once people pass the average face, trustworthiness goes down again. This means that being really attractive can also make someone seem less trustworthy. If they are too hot, they are also different, and humans don't trust different. While we are talking about attractiveness, you have probably heard about the attractive faces are symmetrical. This is true, but only up to a point. According to a systematic review of the face surgery literature by Tim Wang and colleagues, they found that although facial symmetry is intimately correlated with attractiveness, perfect facial symmetry is disconcerting and a degree of facial asymmetry is considered normal. Related to the finding that creepiness is in the eyes, the authors of this study found that asymmetry of the eyelid position at rest is the most sensitive facial feature. This means that if someone's eyes are too symmetrical or too asymmetrical, we perceive this as problematic. Once again, too much either way is bad. Have an unsymmetrical droopy eyelid? Creepy. Completely symmetrical? Also creepy. Really? Adding or changing anything about the face that makes it deviate from the average humanoid makes it creepier? And whether it's from birth, injury, or botched plastic surgery, most of us don't choose to have creepy faces. Yet having a facial disfigurement makes us more likely to be the target of staring on the street and discrimination at work. Even something as innocuous as acne can affect our trustworthiness ratings. In 2016, Elney and Arvik Kapas published a study which showed that skin smoothness, lack of acne affects evaluations of trustworthiness, competence, attractiveness, and health. Even small choices we make, like getting a tattoo near the face, can disadvantage us. One study found that it means people look more alike, a criminal to others. So, much of this is out of our control and doesn't correspond to our psychological characteristics. But humans are still likely to disadvantage us if our face is creepy. This leads us into the territory of human cruelty. Humans have long psychologically and physically abused people who look different. From childhood, faces grab our attention if they don't look the way we expect them to, typically in a bad way. Children are cruel to those who look different. People with facial disfigurements have long been harassed and publicly ridiculed. Why do we commit such cruelty? For one, there is the basic evolutionary argument that deformities and asymmetry can be signs of genetic disease and weakness. We are naturally averse to disease, an aversion to which we partially owe our survival. This translates into seeing signs of diseases as bad. We gravitate to those who look fertile and healthy. We shy away from those who don't, those who might infect us. This might help to explain why we avoid certain people, but it doesn't explain why we might also act cruelly toward them. An argument that I find particularly compelling to explain this cruelty has to do with our perception of faces in pieces. Katrina Fincher and colleagues published a paper in 2017 where they argue that the way we perceive faces can result in dehumanizing the person. If we perceive a face where nothing particularly stands out, we take it all at once. We perceive it as a whole, as human. However, as soon as there's something that captures our attention by being abnormal, we start to deconstruct the face and we start to deconstruct the person. We see the deformity, the poorly spaced eyes, the funny nose, the acne, the tattoo, and we stop seeing the face as a human whole. The authors argue that this involves a shift from configural to featural processing, from looking at a face as a whole, a configuration, to just focusing on individual features. This, they argue, enables the infliction of harm, such as harsh punishments. Just as Hitler was able to do harm because he stopped seeing people as human beings, So, too, our perception can play a trick on us and lead us to perpetual dehumanization. The only way to combat this is to be aware that this can happen and to stop and think when our first reaction to someone is that they are creepy. Feel free to chat with that person with the neck tattoo, hire the woman with the adult acne, and educate your kids not to stare at the person with a facial deformity. Humans have a hard time accepting different faces, but one thing that is often even harder to accept is a different mind. Mental illness is something that is often associated with creepiness, evil, and crime. Sit with me. It's the same reason I'm afraid of the dark. I don't know what's there. I can't see it, so it could be anything. It's the unpredictability. People who think differently than we do make us wonder what they will do next. We cannot understand their way of thinking. Our behavior predictors misfire. Humans don't like that kind of unpredictability. Order and control are safe. Unpredictability is potentially unsafe. Unpredictability is thus perceived as dangerous. That there is a stigma of mental illness is no revelation, yet it's a persistent and devastating bias. One of the most noticeable biases that arises when we notice that someone is mentally ill is that we keep our distance. We keep our distance both socially and physically. Part of this implicit that bias can be showcased by an experiment that highlights our intuitive association between violence and mental illness and was conducted by Ross Norman and colleagues in 2010. They asked participants to stay in a waiting room where they were going to meet a young woman with schizophrenia. There they found 7 chairs in a row along the wall. A clipboard and sweater could be clearly seen on the second chair, and participants were told that this was her chair, and she would return shortly. She wasn't actually in the room, so the participants couldn't be influenced by how she looked like or by her symptoms. Of course, this study was about observing the participants' behaviors. The researchers wanted to know whether the participants would sit near to her or not. They found that the participants sat between 2 and 3 chairs, 2.44 chairs to be exact, from where they expected the woman with schizophrenia to be seated upon her return. That's not actually too bad, but the researchers argue that this shows us that subtle things like mental illness can affect how we treat someone socially. Do you think that on average you would sit closer to a person who wasn't schizophrenic? Probably. Every time you feel this way, consider that this is especially true if the person with schizophrenia is clearly experiencing what we called positive symptoms. For example, we are talking to an imaginary friend or reacting to hallucinations. These symptoms are called positive, not because they are good, but because they are a bonus personal reality. They see and hear things that are not there. These symptoms stand in contrast to negative ones, such as flattened emotions. Men or women, young or old, many of us have a strong creepiness radar, and this idea that we are creeped out by those who are psychologically unwell is further supported by a study from 2012 by Parker Magan and colleagues, which showed that almost 30% of people in a medical waiting room said that they would be uncomfortable sharing it with someone diagnosed with schizophrenia. A further 12% said that they would be uncomfortable sharing with someone who has depression. Some have argued that this stigmatization of those who are mentally unwell could be considered a second disease. Because of the way that others treat them, those who are mentally ill often also suffer from increased anxiety, stress, and lower quality of life. Even children can be seen as dangerous. How so? If they are different. In 2007, sociologist Bernes and colleagues published a study that looked at the perceived dangerousness of children with mental health problems. They examined data from 1,152 respondents who were asked to rate the dangerousness of children in various short stories about them. They found that a child with depression was more than twice as likely to be assessed as dangerous toward others and 10 times as likely to be assessed as dangerous toward himself or herself than children with other health problems. They also found a similar pattern for children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder (ADHD). Compared with the child with daily troubles, the child with ADHD was perceived as roughly twice as likely to be dangerous to others and to self. Kids with depression and ADHD are perceived to be dangerous. But is this warranted? Are they more dangerous? This is a common theme in horror movies and video games, portraying innocent-looking but actually dangerous children. One of the first horror movies I ever watched, for which I was far too young, was all about a group of children taking over a town with mind control. They were sadistic and vengeful little kids, but it's not just infection. The media also delves into the mental health of real children who act out, particularly those who commit extreme violence, and it doesn't get much more extreme in the world of violent kids than school shooters. Trying to understand lethal school violence has prompted wild speculations from a public desperately trying to explain how innocence can be corrupted at such a young age. It has also prompted research from large-scale institutions. One such initiative was an in-depth study funded partially by the National U.S. Research Council by Mark Moore and colleagues. One of the major conclusions from this wide-scale investigations was that serious mental health problems, including schizophrenia, clinical depression, and personality disorders, surfaced after the shootings, for most of the shooters, all of whom were boys. Their study also concluded, however, that there were a number of other risk factors, but that none of them were particularly problematic. Most of the shooters weren't considered to be a high risk for this kind of behavior by the adults around them. Despite being close to them, neither parents nor teachers believe that they are high-risk individuals, never mind the devastating violence that was eventually perpetrated. Although they happen too often, particularly in the US, school shootings are statistically still a rare event. This makes it difficult to study them and to understand exactly what has led children to make these horrific decisions. But from initial investigations, it doesn't seem that mental illness is in itself the cause of lashing out, rather part of a complex array of problems. Problems that can include isolation, bullying, lack of parental support, substance abuse, and easy access to guns. So, taking this back to the bigger picture, are we steering clear of those who we know are mentally ill because we are intuitively tapping into a true sign of dangerousness? Well, the answer to this is complicated. According to Julia and colleagues, these perceptions are biased. Although there is a significantly elevated risk for violence, the risk is small, and the majority of individuals with mental illness are not violent. This is because when we start with a really small risk, even if we double or triple it, we still have a very small number. What does that mean? For one, it means that it matters what kind of mental illness the person has. In a study of offenders with mental illnesses by Gillian Peterson and colleagues from 2014, they found that of the 429 crimes they coded, 4% related directly to a psychosis, including symptoms of schizophrenia, 3% related to depression, and 10% related to bipolar disorder. This means there's only a correlation between mental illness and crime for a very small set of diagnoses, including most notably schizophrenia, depression, and bipolar disorder. As the authors concluded, psychiatric symptoms relate weakly to criminal behavior. It seems that even when someone is mentally ill, even if they have the most risky symptoms, they are very rarely violent simply because of their symptoms. Instead, it's often the same kinds of circumstances that contribute to violence in general that also contribute to violence for the mentally ill. So, where do we get a connection between crime and mental illness at all? Well, it seems that this link has to do with another factor, substance abuse. Someone with schizophrenia or depression is more likely than the average person to take drugs or engage in problematic drinking. For example, a study from 2015 by Ragnar and colleagues placed the rate of diagnosed substance use disorders 25.1% for schizophrenia, 20.1% for bipolar disorder, and 10.9% for depression. They concluded that patients with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depressive illness had up to a tenfold higher prevalence of SUD, substance use disorder, compared to the population estimate. Substance use in these circumstances might be an attempt of self-medication or escapism from the awful symptoms that they are experiencing, or because brains that are struggling sometimes make bad decisions. And here is where we tie the link back in. Mental illness is the risk factor for substance abuse, which in turn is the risk factor for violence. According to the results of a systematic review of the literature on schizophrenia and violence by Fazl and colleagues published in 2009, schizophrenia and other psychoses are associated with violence and violent offending, particularly homicide. However, Most of the excess risk appears to be mediated by substance abuse comorbidity. In other words, almost all of the increase in risk happens when someone with schizophrenia also drinks or takes drugs. In addition, this increase in risk seems to be the same for anyone else who drinks or takes drugs. The risk in these patients with comorbidity is similar to that for substance abuse without psychosis. It seems that substance abuse is the causal link here, not the mental illness per se. Mental illness alone is a poor indicator of violent tendencies. The emotional and physical distance we keep from those who are mentally ill is both unfounded and devastating for those affected. Most societies have come a long way from sticking those with mental illness into inhumane, insane asylums, conducting exorcism to get rid of their evil spirits, or subjecting them to public ridicule and abuse. But there is still much progress to be made. We need to fight our misfiring creepiness detectors. Those with mental illness may seem unpredictable, but unpredictable doesn't mean violent. Approach different. Don't fear it. Take a chance next time and sit next to the stranger who's acting weird, unless they are drunk or high. Let's recalibrate society's relationship with mental illness. Shocking. You have probably heard of Stanley Milgram's classic study on obedience from 1963. In this study, participants were told that they had been assigned the role of teacher and had to administer shocks to a learner every time the learner made a mistake recalling words from a list. The learner, who was actually a research associate, was in an adjacent room. The teacher was told by the experimenter to increase the voltage every time the learner made a mistake, from an initial 15 volts up to eventual 450 volts, the latter of which was labeled danger, severe shock. At some point, the learner protested the increase in the voltage. According to the original manuscript, when the 300-volt shock is administered, the learner pounds on the wall of the room in which he is bound to the electric chair. The pounding can be heard by the subject. From this point on, learner's answers no longer appear. The learner's pounding is repeated after the 315-volt shock is administered. Afterwards, he is not heard from. Essentially, the experimental procedure makes it seem as though the participant has killed the learner. Despite this, only 14 of the 40 men who took part in this study broke it off before the highest voltage was reached. It was an incredible demonstration that some of us will follow an authority figure who is instructing us to act against our conscience, even in a situation as basic as a psychology experiment. We will come back to the topic of obedience to authority in a later chapter, but here I want to talk about the participants' emotional response to their behavior. As could be expected, most of the participants expressed extreme stress during the experiment. They whimpered protests to the experimenter like, "I don't think this is very inhumane. It's a hell of an experiment. This is crazy." And after the study was over, obedient participants mopped their brows, rubbed their fingers over their eyes, or nervously fumbled cigarettes. But one unexpected response was seen in relation to this stress, which Milgram found fascinating. It was the participants' nervous laughter. One sign of tension was the regular occurrence of nervous laughing fits. 14 of the 40 subjects showing definite signs of nervous laughter and smiling. The laughter seemed entirely out of place, even bizarre. Full-blown, uncontrollable seizures were observed for 3 subjects. On one occasion we observed a seizure so violently convulsive that it was necessary to call a halt to the experiment. The subject, a 46-year-old salesman, was seriously embarrassed by his untoward and uncontrollable behavior. Why were they laughing? Surely they weren't happy about electrocuting a stranger. No, it seemed that they were laughing for some other reason, and that they were embarrassed about it. Laughter and smiling are often associated with evil. We think of an evil witch cackling, a laughing serial killer, a devil's grin. While this may be an automatic response in the face of stress and uncertainty, it's deposited in this uncertainty, leading to circumstances as an expression of sadistic pleasure. This image is something that participants in the Milgram experiment were aware of. In the post-experimental interviews, subjects took pains to point out that they were not sadistic types, and that the laughter didn't mean that they enjoyed shocking the victim. We have talked about incongruent emotions before, when we discussed cute aggression, and that is probably a protective mechanism. The brain is trying not to short-circuit when extreme emotions are experienced. by making us experience the counter emotion. We can accept that we might give a nervous laugh when we do something that scares us, or smile during a funeral, or feel like we want to hurt a pet that we love. Yet we struggle to see the similarity between incongruent facial expressions during violent acts and those in other situations. We find people who show the wrong emotions at the wrong time creepy. According to Roy and Keith Campbell, laughter can be so creepy because of how victims and perpetrators differ in their perception and experience of wrongdoing. This is related to what Baumeister referred to as the magnitude gap. The essence of the magnitude gap is that the victim loses more than the perpetrator gains, he explains. For example, when a thief steals something, the replacement value to the victim is typically more than what the thief can sell it for. A rapist may experience brief empowerment, but the victim may suffer for years. A murderer takes a life and inflicts pain and suffering to the family of the victim, a loss which can be never matched by the murderer's gain. This imbalance matters hugely. Because of this magnitude gap, victims often describe the actions of the offenders as gratuitous. A victim may emphasize that the perpetrator's action was for no reason at all, or as acting out of sheer malice. As Baumeister and Campbell write, the magnitude of an act may be much less in the perpetrator's than in the victim's perspective, and therefore to understand the psychology of perpetrators, it may be necessary to distance oneself from the victim's view. When we talk about evil, we are generally siding with victims and seeing harm from their perspective. As such, victims may focus on a perpetrator's laughter, while perpetrators hardly ever mention it. Moreover, victims take the perpetrator's laughter as a compelling sign that the perpetrators were enjoying themselves, and hence as a sign of evil, sadistic pleasure. We can forgive victims of violence for failing to make the subtle attributional adjustments to correctly interpret the laughter of their tormentors. Being the victim of violence can be hugely stressful. If the perpetrator is actually enjoying themselves as perceived by the victim, then the magnitude gap becomes a chasm, a loss-to-gain ratio, so large that it becomes irreconcilable. This we call evil. An evil laugh is a hallmark of creepiness, as it is the ultimate expression of the magnitude gap. Let's switch gears to another attribute of creepiness. Remember our study from the beginning of this chapter, which explained the various things that we find creepy, like people being clowns, or taxidermists, or standing too close, or having long fingers. This study also addressed one final aspect of creepiness, the hobbies of creepy people. Collectors are apparently top of the creepy list. According to McAndrew and Kwenke, easily the most frequently mentioned creepy hobbies involved collecting things, collecting dolls, insects, reptiles, or body parts such as teeth, bones, or fingernails were considered especially creepy. Yay, obviously. Murder INC. I think that most among the weirdest things people can collect are murderabilia. In 2009, American attorney and writer Ellen Hurley defined murderabilia as anything offered for sale that was either created by or owned by a murderer, as well as any item related to a notorious crime over which the criminal may or may not have any control. Murderabilia is seen as derogatory term by some collectors, but let's approach this fascination with an open and non-judgmental outlook. Sometimes murderabilia is sold by the murderers themselves from prison. For example, take John Wayne Gacy, an American serial killer who sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men in the 1970s. He went dressed as Pujo, the clown, to neighborhood parties. During his time in prison, he made and sold some rather terrible paintings of clowns surrounded by dwarfs and children. Then there is Herbert Mullen, who killed 13 people because he allegedly thought that it prevented earthquakes from hearing command hallucinations that ordered him to kill people. Mullen went on to paint some pretty nice pictures of mountain ranges in prison. According to Matthew Wagner, who at the time was editor of the University Law Review, the concept of murderabilia is impregnated with our cultural celebration of celebrity and history on the one hand, and fascination with the occult and heinous crimes on the other. He argues that murderabilia market has really flourished since the emergence of e-commerce, moving the sale and trade of the murderabilia away from the obscure collectors to a full-blown marketplace. Perhaps
Also, because of the anonymity of the buyers, online business is booming. As you might intuit, the fact that lawyers are writing about this topic is because this market has been imbued with controversy since its inception. The question that arises is whether it's okay for criminals to profit from their crimes. Offenders who sell items often attract moral outrage from victims and the general public. The moral outrage has actually become legalization in the USA in the form of the so-called Son of Sam laws. According to Wagner, these were named after the original statute, passed by the New York legislature, and were intended to prevent serial killer David Berkowitz from making a small fortune selling the rights to his story to media outlets. In direct response to speculation that Berkowitz would sell the movie rights to his life, although he never actually expressed an interest in this, the laws were passed preemptively and to prevent offenders from benefiting from such arrangements. However, laws like this are incredibly difficult to enforce, as they generally violate free speech rights, at least in the US. While it's difficult to stop the sale at the source, e-commerce sites themselves have control over what they can sell. For example, giants like Amazon have policies against selling items that are likely to cause outrage, including human remains and Nazi memorabilia. Countries, too, can regulate the sale of items that profit from hate. Germany made the sale of Hitler's manifesto illegal until a significantly annotated scholarly had critical version that came out in 2016. Perhaps Germany felt that Ziztest was once again one of the racial hatred and wanted to showcase and warn against how fascism is born. However, offenders making and selling their stories or their crafts or their toenails is not illegal, and I don't think it should be. By seeing the issue from one side, which is the victim side, we might again be seeing the issue through the filter of the magnitude gap. Yes, prison sentences are often insufficient for victims and their families to achieve a sense of justice after a severe crime has been committed, and the idea that a perpetrator can regain any sense of normalcy and use their story to earn money seems perverse. Indeed, lawyers may know the phrase extirpi causa non orior actu, which essentially means we cannot profit from our own immoral actions. But if we avoid the temptation to see this issue only from the side of the victim, we see someone who is already paying their dues to society, to justice. Nobody is sentenced to 4 years in prison, plus 4 years in which you are unable to make money from what you have done. Tough on crime sentencing and the long-term denial of rights dehumanizes huge members of people, and it's not like most offenders kill for notoriety or to profit from the story. Fame and fortune are an incredibly rare and lucky consequence, but I digress. We started by talking about the buyers, not the sellers, of murderabilia. So why are people interested in buying souvenirs from the dark side of humanity? According to sociologist Jack Denham, it has been argued that the activity of remembering through dark tourism, while being a morbid form of entertainment, can be seen as a method of confronting and coping with death in modern societies. More obviously, the offenders people choose to idolize those who have fans, are those who embody other characteristics that society values. While their deeds may be grossly offensive, their methods can be admired. A serial killer who goes long unnoticed is one who is awfully meticulous, plans well, and has control over the situation. On top of that, they can be seen as rebels who play by their own rules. They are the very embodiment of the counterculture. Someone who really mastered this branding was Charles Manson. Manson saw that this is going to be apocalyptic race war and called Helter Skelter, and he thought that starting a cult which murdered people would help to get it started. After he was caught and imprisoned, Manson became the king of his own branding. He released commercial music, made spiders out of yarn, and created some pretty psychedelic paintings. According to Denham, Manson is a countercultural icon and is consumed as such through this array of merchandise. Fans of serial killers and murderabilia seem to attribute mythical qualities to gruesome and deviant acts. It's more than a fascination with murder. It's the admiration of celebrity, of meticulousness, and of the counterculture that they represent. Perhaps it's still difficult to understand the fascination with murderabilia. Perhaps we still think it's creepy, but maybe we can have a glimpse of understanding after all. And if you want your own, you can always stop by Serial Killers Inc. Murder Auction or supernote. In addition to collecting, a few other hobbies were mentioned by the McAndrew and Quincke research, also perceived as creepy, were people who like to watch, follow, or take pictures of people. One funny inclusion was bird watchers. I guess this is a form of watching. Even if I personally don't think it's very creepy, I just think of a person wearing tweed, looking at trees with binoculars. A fascination with taxidermy were also frequently mentioned as creepy. I don't know anyone who stuffs or collects dead animals for fun, but I guess that could be creepy, and brings us back to thinking about death, which is closely related to our sense of creepiness. Finally, the study found that pornography or exotic sexual activity were linked with creepiness. Given the strong relationship between unwanted sexual interest and creepiness, it's no surprise that being into kinky sex is on the list. Wrapping up, it seemed that creepiness is the result of a system that is trying to keep us safe, but it's poorly calibrated. We misidentify Nobel winners as notorious offenders. We think that people are creepy because they deviate from the norm in looks, mental health, behavior, and interests. You can choose to take this information on board and decreep yourself, or you can simply ignore it. Another system that is often trying to keep us safe but can spectacularly fail to do so is technology. As we experience a world that is even more influenced by the presence of smartphones, airplanes, and the internet, we can ask ourselves how this is influencing us and how we are influencing it. Next, we will look into why and how we use technology to do bad, and how technology itself can misbehave. Have you ever noticed that devil is just the word evil with the letter D attached to the in front of it? It just reminds us how closely we link the religious concept of the devil and the wrongdoing. And this concludes part 3.